Am I live now? Okay. Um, so the interface just crashed on me. It may crash again, but for those who may not be aware, I'm a live stream audiobook reader, and I'm just gonna restart. But yeah, hi. Okay, my name is Phoebe, and I normally do my Read Aloud live streams in different corners of Weird Book. And I've done a couple previously here, both reading from Flatline Constructs, which we'll be continuing with tonight. And I haven't had any of the admins tell me to stop. So that's what we're going to be doing this evening. And for the record, I can't control the weird autofocusing thing going on with my webcam, but okay, and I'm not muted. Mark Fisher, Flatline Constructs. How an android must feel. Deckard. Replicants weren't supposed to have feelings. Neither were Blade Runners. There's an intriguing scene in the middle of Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, a novel best known now as the source of Ridley Scott's Blade Runner of 1982. Rick Deckard and Phil Resch, two bounty hunters whose prey is not human beings but androids, have pursued a target to a museum where a Munch Myok exhibition is showing. Pausing in front of what is evidently the scream, twisted ripples of the creature's torment, echoes of its cry, flooded out into the air surrounding it. The man or woman, whichever it was, had become contained by its own howl. Resch comments, I think this is how an Andy must feel. To anyone acquainted with Frederick Jameson's analyses, the connection Resch makes should raise a number of questions. For Jameson, the scream is a canonical representation of the great modernist thematics of alienation, enemy, solitude, isolation, a virtually programmatic emblem of what used to be called the Age of Anxiety. Whereas Dick's novel and Blade Runner have held up, at least not by Jameson himself, as quintessentially postmodern. If the scream does really communicate the alienation, enemy, solitude to point melancholy humanist-ish subjectivity, as Jameson suggests, how can an android, non-human simulacrum of the human, have any affinity with it? Is there something to account for the appearance of an expressionist imagery and thematics in Blade Runner other than the notorious pastiche effect? What does an android feel, anyway? To begin to answer these questions is to start to pick apart the theoretical approaches that have dominated commentary on Blade Runner and Philip K. Dick. This will involve, initially, weaving a few more strands in the already existing rhizome theory that has run around and through Blade Runner. Much commentary has already been made on the connection between Scott's film and the almost directly contemporary cyberpunk fiction of William Gibson, thereby clicking onto a literary genealogy that includes Burroughs and Ballard as well as Dick. Parallels have also been made with the films of David Cronenberg. Critical reception of these authors has been dominated by debates on postmodernism and postmodernity. Theorists with a wide variety of responses to postmodernism, negative, ambivalent, and neutral, have all cited one or all of them as exemplars of postmodern practice. Jameson famously goes as far as to call cyberpunk the supreme literary expression, if not of modernism, of postmodernism, then of late capitalism itself. What follows will not reject these postmodernist approaches so much as it will envelop them, as it will envelop cyberpunk fiction, to what it will call gothic materialism. To suggest that many of Gothic materialism's principal resources come from Deleuze-Guattari's Capitalism and Schizophrenia is not to imply that it is in some sense a transcendent deployment or application of Deleuze-Guattari's work, in part because whatever Gothic materialism can use, it becomes. So, when it emerges, Gothic materialism describes deleuze guattari, not the other way around, their work appearing now as a clicking together of Gothic authors whose names are legion: Lovecraft, Artaud, Freud, Marx, Schreber, Warringer. In part, then, what follows will present a materialist critique of postmodernism, the kind of postmodernist theories Gothic materialism interfaces with, are those it already haunts. Not thinkers who process reality through a textualist or linguistic grid, but theorists who understand postmodernity as an essentially material phenomenon, describing its effects primarily in terms of the impact that new telecommercial configurations have on the human nervous system. Jameson, certainly, but also Baudrillard, and one of his key antecedents, Marshall McLuhan. One of those names I've read multiple times but never actually said aloud. Along with many of these words, as you have probably noticed. Prompted by what, at first sight, appears to be an invasion of the human body by technology, McLuhan and Baudrillard's work follows on the metapsychological Freud in describing a becoming technical of the organism. As we shall see in more detail in the next chapter, this reverses the idea of extensions of man McLuhan develops in Understanding Media. The concept of media as extensions of the human body is a direct echo of the organicist confidence Freud had displayed in Civilization and its discontents when he wrote of technology making man a prosthetic god. What Baudrillard picks up on is the other side of Freud and the other side of McLuhan, a side that doesn't stress the extension of the organic interiority or its invasion, but the folding out of interiority into a pure exteriority registered by the subject as shock or trauma. For Baudrillard, then, the cultural reconfigurations that Jameson identifies do not mark the end of the age of anxiety, as Jameson thinks. Rather, they usher in a new era of anxiety. The characteristics of this new age of anxiety have already been delineated by McLuhan. I'm just going to pronounce it differently every single time, until someone says something. Whereas modernist anxiety is founded upon the inescapability of individual freedom, its themes are individual solitude, social fragmentation, and alienation. By contrast, McLuhan's have to be creative at this point. McLuhan's anxiety, anticipation of Baudrillard's, is exactly contrary. It has its origin in a social disalienation and the denial or penetration by the media, and so by everyone else, of any margins of solitude or alienation. Modernist anxiety involves the withdrawal to an ordinary identity resistant to immersion in the forms of modernization. McLuhan's postmodern anxiety has given up this resistant identity and has no anchorage in individual thought or feeling. Which brings us back to Munch, to Dick, and to Jameson, who comes across the screen during the course of his celebrated discussion of the waning of affect. Jameson does not want to argue, he insists, that the cultural products of the postmodern era are utterly devoid of feeling, but rather that such feelings, which it may be better and more accurate, following J.F. Lyotard, to call intensities, are now free-floating and impersonal and tend to be dominated by a peculiar kind of euphoria. This peculiar kind of euphoria, feeling, floating free from any qualification by the personal, is what Baudrillard has called ecstasy. Ecstasy, which has an ostensibly inverse but effectively indistinguishable state, dread, arises when the subject is jacked into late capitalism's network of cybernetic communications. Plugged into the network, traversed by it, Baudrillard's terminal man knows that retreat into the private space is no longer an option, and that this awareness generates a new sense of terror, for Baudrillard the state of terror proper to the schizophrenic. Too great a proximity of everything, the unclean promiscuity of everything touches, invests, and penetrates without resistance, and with no halo of private projection in order to protect him anymore. Both dread and ecstasy arise from a loss of the sense of self as a delimitable identity, a delimitable entity, a white or black out of identity that can just as easily be experienced as terror or euphoria. And dread is a kind of jouissance in a negative, a slow subsistence into uncontrol and panic. Also, for the record, Lyotard is another one of those words and names I have read multiple times, never actually said aloud. Following Lyotard through his rerouting of Kantian aesthetics, Jameson calls this simultaneous apprehension of ecstasy and dread the postmodern sublime. For Gothic materialism, the sublime still belongs to a humanist aesthetic of representation, precisely because it fixes what lies beyond representation as the unrepresentable. Gothic materialism's aesthetic theory, as we shall see below, derives not from Burke and Kant, nor from some postmodern reinvention of their theories, but from Wilhelm Ronger, whose two treatises on barbarian art, Forming Gothic and Abstraction and Empathy, both reanimated by Deleuze, Guattari, and 1,000 Plateaus, oppose representation not to the unrepresentable, but to the abstract. Gothic materialism is, above all, an abstract materialism, distinguished from other types of materialism, including what Baudrillard disparagingly refers to as anthropomarxism, and from every sort of idealism, by its focusing principally on the organ grinder, the non-organic processes of stratification that produce the organism, rather than the monkey. Anthropoid consciousness is manifested in an experience of subjectivity screened through the Freudian perceptual consciousness system. Such processes have agents, but they are not human, humanistic, or subjectivist. They are abstract machines. In other words, Gothic materialism takes literally what Marx critically denounced as the fantasy of capital as an automatic system of machinery set in motion by an automaton, a moving power that moves itself. It assumes, with Deleuze-Guattari's schizoanalysis, that the possibility of transcendently critiquing capitalism, kept alive in a mournful kind of way by Jameson, ostensibly abandoned but effectively retained by Baudrillard, has always been dysfunctional, for the simple reason that capitalism defines a field of immanence and never ceases to occupy this field. While anthropomarxism still posits a transcendent and authentic human agent which could overcome capital, Gothic materialism takes for granted that real materialism must involve a total immanentization. One of its chief resources, therefore, is the philosopher whose work was devoted to developing a rigorously immanent account of agency, Spinoza. For Spinoza, there is agency everywhere, but this never belongs to the human subjects. The ethics, therefore, does not identify subjects or objects, rather it entifies. Spinoza disontologies all subjective, generic, and species distinctions into a single Gothic classification, the entity. We are wont to classify all the individuals in nature under one genus, namely the notion of entity, which pertains to all individuals in nature without exception. Bodies are defined not by form or function, but as processes. In other words, true entities are events. Crucial in this respect is Deleuze-Guattari's concept of the haecity. This haecity / can be defined briefly as non-subjectified individuation. It is individuation as intensive multiplicity, not extensive address. For Deleuze-Guattari, the haecity is a mode of individuation very different from that of a person, subject, thing, or substance. A season, a winter, summer, an hour, a date have perfect individuality, lacking nothing, even though this individuality is different from that of a thing or a subject. The ecstasy is... Someone please comment and let me know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, because that's cringe. I feel cringe. The Hecate is the entity as event and the event as entity. It occurs when things cease to be subjects, to become events. It should not be thought that a hyacity, consists of simply a decor or a backdrop that situates subjects, or of appendages that hold things and people to the ground. Deluge warn. It is the entire assemblage and its individuated aggregate that is a hyacity. The Gothic has an affinity with the concept of the hyacity because it refuses to distinguish human figures from backgrounds. The Gothic, or the northern decorative line, is a broken line which forms no contour by which form and background might be distinguished. You can't enter such zones without entering into composition with them. This word's gonna haunt me. Hacetites, Deleuze say, find expression in a particular semiotic. This semiotic is composed of above all of proper names, verbs in the infinitive, and indefinite articles or pronouns. Indefinite article plus proper name plus infinitive verb constitutes the basic chain of expression of a semiotic that has freed itself from both formal significances and personal subjectifications. Deleuze-Guattari's vindication of this semiotic, a positivization of the indefinite, is simultaneously a theory of horror, a critique of psychoanalysis, and a program for cyberotics. Whereas psychoanalysis, Deleuze-Guattari argue, always seeks to reduce the indefinite to the definite. When the child says, a belly, a horse, how do people grow up? Someone is beating a child. The psychoanalyst hears, my belly, the father. Will I grow up to be like Daddy? Rhizomatics understands that the desire operates through the indefinite. Flat multiplicities are designated by indefinite articles, or rather by paratives. Some couchgrass, some of a rhizome. The Gothic use of such terms as the unnameable, the thing, the nameless, favored by Deleuze-Guattari themselves, implies a modification of this model. Here, indefinite adverb nouns function to de-definitize definite articles. Gothic materialism is flat with its material. It names both the mode of analysis and what it is to be analyzed. It does not arbitrarily conjoin materialism with the Gothic, but insists that all effective materialism must lead out towards a non-organic discontinuum. Amongst other things, the Gothic can serve as a proper name for this continuum, and cyberpunk is the registering of its arrival on the terminals of a wired humanity. While an organicist left social criticism finds in cyberpunk the quietist collapse of the transformative political projects into a hard-boiled survivalist hypernihilism, Gothic materialism locates in Baudrillard's ecstatic communication, Gibson's cyberspace, Jameson's total flow, and Cronin's videodrome, the map of a hypermediatized capitalism that is decoding privatized subjectivity. Organicist postmodern theory has tended to read cyberpunk as the apogee of Cartesianism, the story, now told in part ironically, of the triumph of disembodied mind over docile body, this latter referred to by Gibson's cyberspace cowboys as meat. Told this way, the story has inevitable gender implications. It is a rerun of the old narrative of the hylomorphic domination of nature by man. For Andrew Ross, for instance, cyberpunk male bodies are spare, lean, and temporary bodies whose social functionality could only be maintained through the reconstructive aid of a whole range of genetic overhauls and cybernetic enhancements. Boosterware, biochip wetware, cyber optics, bioplastic surgery, designer drugs, nerve amplifier, prosthetic limbs and organs, memory wear, neural interface plugs, and the like. Yet this is still to buy into the story the cowboys tell themselves, a story which the narratives they are embedded in refuse to maintain. It is to treat the body as the container for and of a self which will ultimately escape it, in techno-transcendence. Ross is aware that cyberpunk is much more ambivalent than this, that it also tells of the invasion of the male, in the parenthetical male organism, by technical machines, deliberately echoing the Baudrillard of ecstasy of communication. He describes the cyberpunk body as a switching system with no purely organic integrity to defend or advance, and only further enhancements of the technological edge to gain in the struggle for technological advantage. These enhancements and retrofits were techno-toys that the boys had always dreamed of having, but they are also body-altering and castrating in ways that boys always had nightmares about. Yet, as we have already seen, to oppose invasion of the organism with its extension is still not the process the materialist critique of cyberpunk presents. The spinozistic, cybernetic unraveling of the organism back into its environment. Ross always recodes cyberpunk sensations in terms of a psychopathology and a politics, an effective range, whose continuing purchase on contemporary reality the very existence of cyberpunk radically questions. Despite sharing some of Ross's attachment to transcendent social criticism, Jameson nevertheless realizes that the new cultural configurations cannot be theorized using this old, parenthetical, psychoanalytic language. What he calls the decline of the affect is signaled in part by a liberation from the older enemy of the centered subject, an ambiguous liberation which may also mean a liberation from from every other kind of feeling as well, since there is no longer a self present to do the feeling. Jameson's analysis here parallels that of Baudrillard in suggesting that the end of the bourgeois ego or monad brings with it a concomitant end of the psychopathologies of that ego. No more hysteria, no more projective paranoia, Baudrillard announces in the ecstasy of communication. If, as Baudrillard says, there is no more hysteria, then, contra Ross, there is no more castration either. For Baudrillard, as we have seen, castration here has become reversed. Media implicitly feminize, not cutting man off, but penetrating without resistance. The dread here corresponds to the masculine terror Klaus Thelwit describes in Male Fantasies, as it is a terror of being inundated, overwhelmed by what Jameson calls the total flow of hyperconnected cybernetic culture. Cyberpunk registers a trauma that Ross, apparently secure in his organic interiority, still thinks can be commented upon from the point of view of an unproblematic humanist transcendence. The terror for Gibson's characters and for Cronenberg's is not just, or even primarily, that the interior of their bodies will be invaded, but that they do not have any insides. This dread gives rise to the startling images of Cronenberg's Videodrome. Infamously, at one point in the film, the lead character Max Wren's body literally opens up, his stomach develops a massive vaginal slit to accommodate a new videocassette program. Image addiction and image virus reduce the subject to the status of the videotape player/recorder. The human body mutates to become part of this massive system of reproductive technology. This is a new type of dread, emerging in theory and fiction simultaneously. As registering of this new horror, Videodrome, like Baudrillard's ecstasy of communication, is a kind of cyberpunk sequel to Freud's anti-Gothic tale, The Uncanny. There, Freud keeps Gothic horror at bay by attributing the feelings of dread and anxiety to a fear of castration. By the time of Baudrillard and Videodrome, the phallic visual scene Freud sought to erect has collapsed into a terrible, cloying tactile intimacy, what Baudrillard calls the obscene. The equation Freud makes between the eye and the penis is no longer relevant in conditions where there is no distance, specular or otherwise. You can't touch without being touched. You can't penetrate what already envelops you, Gibson. No, that wasn't the sentence. Oops. You can't penetrate what already envelops you. Gibson. The matrix folds around me like an origami trick. To simulate the point of view of the androids in Dick's novel is to be drawn to where you, as subject, are turned inside out. To begin to see what the androids could see in Munch's painting is to realize that, for them, it must show not the inevitability of solitary interiority, but its impossibility. The painting's loops and spirals diagramming now not the projection of a subjective state outwards, but the enormous pressure inwards of an exteriority which touches, invests, and penetrates without resistance, and which produces the subject, as Deleuze Guattari would want to say, as a residuum or side effect. The subject is produced as a residuum alongside the machines, as an appendix or as a spare part adjacent to the machine. For Gothic materialism, this, as much as the more familiar territory of modernist angst states, is what Munch and the rest of Expressionism was always getting at. So it will be argued here that cybernetic capitalism does not engender what Ballard has followed Jameson identifying as the death of affect. Those switched on to Spinozism by Deleuze Guattari might suspect the reverse, that what defines the postmodern is in fact the amplification of affect. Brian Masumi suggests that the theorization of intensity Jameson calls for is to be achieved precisely by paying renewed attention to the phenomenon of affect and to Spinoza as its principal theorist. It is crucial, Masumi argues, to theorize the difference between emotion and affect. An emotion is a subjective content, the socio-linguistic fixing of the quality of an experience, which is from that point on defined as personal. Emotion is qualified intensity, the conventional, consensual point of insertion of intensity into semantically formed progressions, to narrativizable action-reaction circuits, to functions and meaning. It is intensity owned and recognized. If some have the impression that affect is waned, it is because affect is unqualified. To account for all of these abstract feelings, abstract is a word for sensations so new that they don't have a name yet, demands a new affective register and a new type of realism, not anymore the empirical realism described and delimited by Kant in the name of transcendental philosophy and echoed in the conventions of the bourgeois realist novel, but a cybernetic realism, a theory fiction for an artificial reality. Bacon. The more artificial you can make it, the greater the chance of its looking real. And, okay. So that was How an Android Must Feel from our boys' Flatline Constructs. And thank you for sitting with me tonight. I'm sorry for any weird technical glitching going on. I took a bit of a break there from streaming in general for a couple weeks or so, and I've been kind of out of it. But anyway, I hope you have a cozy evening, and if you're in America, like I am, my heart is with you because everything is feeling pretty schizoaffective right now, if we're being completely frank. Yeah. I don't know. I will probably be back next week at some point for Xerox and Xenogenesis. Join me then, whenever that may be. Anyway, have a great evening. Thank you so much. Stay safe. And I gotta click the button. Good night.